usually think about the deep ocean as really spooky, so going with the whole Halloween theme. But I have been lucky for the last 3 years to be a postdoc investigator at the biology department at the Woods Hole Oceanographic. And I'm so excited to share with you some of the really amazing animals that live in our very not so scary deep ocean. So a little bit about me. So I got my Ph.D. at Newcastle University in the UK, and I've been really fortunate and I'm realizing that these are all over the last 2 years of being able to spend a lot of time at sea. So I've been on most recently on the RV Falkor 2, using some, high-tech tools to study the deep ocean. So we'll be seeing some footage from landers, and those are basically big tripods that go down to the bottom. I've worked with remotely operated vehicles, which is in photo 2, ROV Sebastian, and we'll also be seeing some video from there. And those are these remotely operated vehicles that we're able to see in real time what's at the bottom. I've spent time up in the Arctic on the RV Polar Stern, looking at actually what animals are coming up from the bottom that we see at the surface. And I've been really fortunate to spend a whole 8 to 5 in Alvin at the East Pacific Rise, and we'll see some of those hydrothermal vents after. There's some great Alvin stickers, and this is one of the most special vehicles, a 3-person human-occupied vehicle. So I'm excited to share with you some of these things that we found while being out at sea. So Earth is we're so special to live on Earth. We think about it as a land planet, like we're on land right now. But it's really not just a blue planet as our astronauts see, but it's this deep ocean planet. And I love this map, which you'll see in the Oceanus magazine. It's called the Spillhouse Projection, and it focuses on our ocean being a one ocean versus being split into 5 different ones. And I love this one that was created by John Nelson at Esri, because it really highlights how vast and deep our deep ocean is, with the brightest parts being our deepest points, which is my personal favorite, and we call that the Hadal Zone. It makes up a small fraction. As you can see, it's kind of like these islands, these very deep inverted islands or mountain ranges on our seafloor. In the lighter brown, which is actually most of our planet, about 54% is 3,000 to 6,000 meters, and so actually most of our planet is this abyssal zone depth. And then our deep ocean also covers from 2,000 to 3,000 meters, and that's the bathyal zone, and that's that darker brown, and it's found a lot right along those continental edges. And so all together, once we wrap that up, our Earth is more than 60% deep ocean. And so while we don't learn about it all the time at school, and it's very understudied, really we're on this deep ocean planet. So I'm excited to share the wonder of really planet Earth with you. So think about, even though we're on land, deep ocean feels really unconnected. It's more than just this unhospitable space. The deep ocean does a lot for us, from helping regulate carbon. It has a wealth of biodiversity. We're able to get some molecules like Taq polymerase is coming from hydrothermal vents. So all of our COVID tests are thanks to Taq polymerase and the polymer PCR step that happens using it. So we have a lot to be thankful for about the deep ocean. And as we saw in that map, the deep ocean is not this contiguous space. Even though that brown looked really like it was this plain or desert, it's broken up into a lot of island-like features that are hosting complex communities. And that's a space that I really like to work in. We can think about really large landscapes, like these hadal depth subduction trenches, which are all in red. And you have probably heard about them in things like the Ring of Fire. And so these are really, it's where two plates collide and one goes under, gets subducted under the other. And they're really tectonically active. And so the deepest place in these large landscapes is Challenger Deep. And so you've probably heard about hadal zone without quite realizing it. There's also these smaller structures. So we've got big landscapes, we have smaller structures like hydrothermal vents, which Phil was talking about, these places that are chemosynthetically active where chemicals are coming up in really hot water, and there's a unique set of microbes that are allowing these oases of life to form. And they're really about as big as this room. So they have a small footprint, but they really have a big impact. And then there's also small fragments like objects. Like, for example, we've got this glacial dropstone. So we see glacial dropstones especially in Massachusetts, but we also see it on the ocean. And each one of these places are places where life can happen. We'll also think about the deep ocean as really far away, even though it's most of our planet. And we'll talk about more, but there's this really sad fact that's kind of looming in the background that depth, that remoteness isn't protecting it from us. And so we're very connected to that. So questions that I ask are really knowing that it's this big part of our planet, humans impact it, or that depth isn't stopping it from feeling how human interactions, but how resilient are these deep ocean ecosystems, particularly in the face of global change. And we can think about resilience, how strong we are to change, or how we can bounce back from change, is really shaped by the animals that are there and how connected they are to these other island ecosystems. So like these hydrothermal vents, if one erupts, how does that relate with its community from a nearby one? So I ask a lot of questions on diversity and distribution, how the environment shapes species and populations, and how remoteness is protecting against anthropogenic impacts. And so we're really here for deep sea videos, but this is a video from the Plata Canyon, right at the mouth. So it's this really large canyon that's off the coast of Argentina. And this is about 1,500 meters. And this was part of the first time an ROV had been into Argentinian waters. But when I see this, I'm struck by how beautiful it is. You think about the interactions between some of these cold water corals, giant barnacles that are on the sides of the wall. How is the flat plain different than those shelves? And so it's all these connections of how are those individual species, how is the environment shaping these really unique ecosystems. So, quick question, what do you, in your mind's eye, think are some of the things that we can find at the bottom of these deepest trenches? So just close your eyes really quick. And maybe, can I get one person to tell me what they think of when they're thinking about our deep ocean? And who's living down there?
I'm thinking of those little fish that light up in the dark.
Amazing, yeah. So fish that are lighting up in the dark, maybe they've got bioluminescence. Maybe they're kind of like this anglerfish-like with their bioluminescent lure. And being Halloween, a lot of times we talk about the deep ocean, like from Finding Nemo, and it being this scary place with weird looking animals that are just there to rip off your arm and take you down all to the way to the bottom with you. And so that's one fish that lives up in bathyal depths, but let's dive down and see another fish that we were able to see in the Mariana Trench and some of the deepest living fish. And so these are actually snailfishes. They're really translucent. They're very slow moving. You can see a number of them together, and so they're very gregarious, and they actually have nice little smiles on their face. And so this is an example from a lander where we're using bait to draw these animals in so that we can see them. So this talk is really about, now that we know more about the deep ocean, but we're really talking about how these animals are not so scary. I work with a lot of not so scary animals that are called amphipods, and they're a type of crustacean. We find them everywhere. Amphipods are amazing. They're super diverse. We can find them in freshwater streams, we can find them in caves, we can find them at the beach, we can find them also at Challenger Deep. And so they really have evolved to be in a lot of different places. In the deep ocean, they're adapted to surviving extreme conditions of high hydrothermal pressure, which this cup up here really signifies that as we go deeper into the ocean, pressure increases. So it's a styrofoam cup that's been compressed. And so the animals that are down there have to be able to survive that. So they've got some unique protein adaptations that helps keep their cell wall open, kind of like Alvin and its titanium sphere when we're in there helps keep the pressure back. They've got their own unique set of proteins to help keep their cell membranes open. These animals are a constant food source for larger predators, and as you can imagine, we can collect them in really high numbers. And generally, they're really easy to collect. So I basically crab trap at some of the deepest parts of the ocean. So to understand a little bit of the work that I do, I really start with who. So I went into a long introduction about who I am. I've gotten to meet some of you, and I do the same thing with amphipods. So when I get new sets of amphipods, I use two different tools. So I look at what they look like, their morphology, get them under a microscope, and then I also sequence them to get their what's called a DNA barcode. And those two types of information help me get a really good identification. And a lot of work goes into getting those identification because there's a lot of unknown species. So these examples here are 5 species that I have described and named. So whether it's a new species, but I've also, in the bottom right corner, is a species that I also raised the genus for, called Civifractura serendipii, or citizen of the fracture zone, and then serendipii to both after a favorite beer of mine and that science is this really serendipitous act. Okay, so we're gonna go through a few stories and about how these animals have big stories to tell us and they're not that scary. So the first one is about the reach that we have. But first I'll just talk about how to name a new species. Because it's not something that's familiar to all of us. But what we do is we collect new specimens, we compare them to ones that are new. I get to prepare a scientific manuscript, which ends up including those 2 sets of data, a lot of drawings, so it's this beautiful combination of science and art together. You submit that to a journal. It goes through peer review, so someone else who's also an expert in taxonomy, they review your work. They'll probably give you some things that you need to improve on, and we go through a vision step. back to the journal, it gets accepted, you're like, woo! And the animal that you drew is called the holotype, which sets the name, and that gets deposited to a museum like the Smithsonian. And then we also have to register it with the official registry. And so you have to follow some rules, like you can't name it after yourself, but you could name it after other people, or things that it ate, places that it lived, maybe a cool feature of it. And then it becomes a new species. So it's really easy to discover these new species, and it takes a lot of work in order to give them their name, which is super fundamental. So Eurythenes plasticus comes from 6,000 meters in the Mariana Trench. And for that, just to highlight kind of part of the process, that pairing of morphology and DNA, we're able to see that it has its own clade within the different species of Eurythenes, so that was clue number 1. And then clue number 2 is actually saw it in its mouth. It had some special characters that distinguished it from other species. So check, check, we were able to say, yes, it's morphologically and genetically new. But there's also this really interesting component that's in the background, that trenches, even though they're really deep, they're really hard to get to, that we only have had a couple of submersibles that have been able to get down there. They're actually have high levels of contamination, from microplastics to synthetic particles like PCBs. These animals, these trenches also have a lot of pollution, and so they're almost, since there's nowhere else to go, everything's kind of funneling downhill. And so it's, sadly, these trenches act like trash cans almost. And so on the back of that, we wanted to understand this animal, does it have any signs of plastic pollution? So one of the 11, we were able to see that it had a microplastic fiber in its stomach. And this is a picture of that fiber. And use this analysis called FTIR to understand what pollutant that was, and learn that it was a plastic of water bottles. And so it was this sad reality that it's sitting on top of the Great Pacific trash gyre, and you know, this isn't an anti-plastic talk, but when I was actually on the ship, I had thought like, oh, this trash gyre, is it really a thing? But there was a calm day, and sitting up at the top, you could actually see a bottle out there, a bottle out there, a bottle out there, and I think I counted about 20 bottles that day. So what's happening, what we think is happening for Eurythenes plasticus, is that we have these bottles that are in the ocean, they're getting broken down by waves and UV into smaller and smaller pieces. As those pieces get smaller, they get heavier, and they're making their way down into the sediment. Eurythenes plasticus ends up being a scavenger, and so it's just trying to find carbon on the seafloor, and it accidentally ingests it. And it really signifies that plastic pollution is everywhere. And so there's what made this species so special is that it has this really big story. It is a bit scary, but it really shows us that what we're doing on land has a big impact on what's happening in this deep part of the ocean. This was part of a campaign for the World Wildlife Fund, and with that, it helped support a UN petition to minimize trash that's making its way into the ocean. It also won a Guinness Book of World Record, and it had this really large breadth on people starting to learn about it. So I've got it actually on a nice coloring sheet for it. Yeah, question?
How big is that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's about, my palm. Yeah, which is actually pretty good size. So some of these animals, they end up have a feature called
Excuse me. Nope,
Yes.
raise your hand and wait.
What I'm thinking is these animals live in like the Pacific, then they should be like swimming in the columns of trash that isn't floating and literally piling up. Like, are these animals like impacted by the trash in the Pacific? Do they make any use of it? Like I've seen some hermit crabs. I've seen a pretty big hermit crab living in a small water bottle.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So things that they're using actually is when they're bigger pieces, say like a shipwreck, things are start to end up growing and living on them, kind of like the stone that was down there. So on these bigger pieces, they can actually use it as habitat too. So it's not just they're eating it, but some of them, they actually like it and use it as a home. So it's like your hermit crab. So yeah, some of the animals, they have gigantuism or they are more giant-like. And so these amphipods, the largest one is called the supergiant, but Eurythenes plasticus is about the size of my palm. So it's not to be so sad, but I think what Eurythenes plasticus really shows is that what we do on land can make a really positive change. And so just make sure you put your trash in the right trash can. Try to minimize the amount of plastic that you're using, and there's ways that we can together change how we interact with plastic goods. So story number 2 talks about, again, we're going to talk about how connected our surface is to the bottom, and we're going to have this really close investigation with this kind of weird looking animal that we spotted on Alvin when it got verified to 6,500 at the Puerto Rico Trench. So Alvin is down there, and this is just this beautiful moment of exploration. And they saw in the distance, like, what is happening? Oh, okay, so we've got an animal here. It has these really long antennae, and it's actually its back or its butt side that's moving up into the water column with these amazing paddles. And as we zoom in even closer, it's now holding what's bigger than its own body size, which again, actually this is slightly bigger than my palm. It's holding some sargassum. And this was so amazing. I had seen this isopod in the Atacama Trench, and then when I saw this video, I got blown away. And this is a story about diving deep into understanding what is happening with this animal.
Hey, excuse me, but what even is that animal?
Yeah,
I want to research it more.
I know. I thought exactly the same thing. I was like, what is this? I had only seen it on a small video, so let's find out. So, what it was carrying was sargassum, which you might have heard of in the news as this macroalgae that's in the Sargassum Sea and in the Caribbean. It can wash up on beaches, but it also can seep down to the seafloor. And we found that this animal is an isopod, and we found that it was really highly adapted to capitalize on this tough sargassum. So sargassum, it's slow to break down, which is why it's a nuisance on beaches. And this is a really gorgeous isopod with these, has three sets of paddles, but 2 are really large, and the really long arms that are able to have it help hold tight to the sargassum. And so we learned how it was so uniquely specialized to eat this sargassum. we did some CT scanning, and we found out that some of its mouth parts were made for tearing algae. And it was also made for crushing algae down. So it was able to rip this apart, mash it down, and then it had some really special support in its digestion. We looked at what was in its stomach and what were the gut microbiomes that were, or gut bacteria that were helping it. And we found that it had a really distinct gut microbiome. Just like we have a really distinct gut microbiome that helps us digest food, it does the same thing. So it had over 95% it had a really low diversity with 4 abundant microorganisms. And those microorganisms had some really special roles. So we were able to look at what the function of these microbes were able to do with some of the molecules that they were able to produce. And so they had things like alginase lyses. So it's able to help break down that macroalgae. And an interesting thing about Sargassum is that it's not just tough, but it's got this carbon to nitrogen imbalance, so it's not actually a really good food source, apparently. But we found that 3 of those really abundant microbes, they had this cool gene, the NIF-operon, which helps with nitrogen fixation. So they're able to supplement for that nitrogen imbalance that is in Sargassum by some of those microbes that are in its stomach. So this isn't the only organism that does that. There's some wood-eating termites, leaf-cutting ants that have this ability. So this was a cool study about understanding more about what this isopod does, that it is getting this Sargassum that has fallen really quickly or sunk really quickly from the surface. It has unique morphology that helps break it down, and it has a really highly specialized and co-evolved gut microbiome to help it break it down. And so this is really tight linkage, again, between what's happening on the surface. So this is, we're looking at Sargassum density. The dots are every place that we found this isopod before, and really it's lining up really well, pretty well with where we have these large blooms of Sargassum. And Sargassum is increasing with a changing climate. So it's going to be a good thing for this isopod to have more Sargassum at the bottom. But a lot of these islands, it's less of a good thing for them. But in this age of climate changing, there's a lot of questions on what's happening with seaweed and happening with Sargassum and sinking it. And it's really, we just realized that we need to understand better who's interacting with it, how much of it is down at the bottom, just because seeing that isopod was such a surprise. Okay, that was a lot of science for a second, so let's get into something that's just really fun and take a little breather. And this is coming from the Schmidt Ocean Institute on the RV Falkor 2. And they're from the Mar del Plata Canyon. And what's amazing about them is they have everything on YouTube. So when they have dives, you can watch their dives at home. And in Argentina, during our expedition, over 17.5 million views. And people got really excited, and I got really excited about this one interaction that we had with ROV Sebastian. It's about 2,000 meters. We have this giant lobster, and it's almost that we were the thing that scared it. And so it's this mom, as we can see, as we zoom in, maybe you can see where her babies are. Anyone can see the babies? I'm going to be ready to fight, and kids, do not get out of your house, is really what she's saying. And so it's this cool flip that actually we're, at times can be the scary one. And so it's that not these animals that are the scary ones.
How big is that lobster?
It's a normal sized lobster.
Is that color unusual? That thing?
So in the deep ocean, so red actually makes you more hidden. So any trace amount of light that could be made bioluminescently, that ends up, the red helps you keep even more camouflaged. And so sometimes things that they're eating can actually help become more red. So we can see the babies kind of in the back. And when we were looking closer, counted about 12 of them back there. So it was just this really great, now we're on my screen, they're a little bit brighter, but just seeing all these little babies and this really great, that these animals have kind of a nurturing capacity to them. And later on in the video, which I wasn't able to find, that mom actually ended up trying to fight with ROV Sebastian. Okay, and my last story is, I think, the scariest animal in the whole deep ocean. And this is called Bathyopsurus sp. Nav. And so for me, this one is the scariest in that both where it came from, but that it is a species that still needs its name. And where it came from is really special. It came from, let's see if we can do this. So it comes from Tika Vent. I was able to collect it on my first Alvin dive. And Tika Vent is a hydrothermal vent in the East Pacific Rise. And it's in one of the best studied vents on our planet. A number of scientists at Woods Hole have experiments, and all over the globe have experiments at Tika Vent and some of the nearby vents. You can see that there's lots of tube worms, there's lots of giant clams, and it's just like this crazy oasis of life. But on April 29th, there was a volcanic eruption, and Alvin actually was able to be there. And we'll see if this all loads. But essentially, a volcanic eruption, and some of the scientists have been tracking when this eruption was going to happen. I'll just go through. But we can kind of see that this big, a natural system change happened, and there was this big lava flow, and so a lot of that habitat ended up being lost, which is really exciting for the scientists that were there, but also exciting for the scientists that have these long-term experiments to understand who is living there. Dun, dun, dun. So, Bathyopsurus sp. Nav, that lives at Tika Vent, is one of the scariest ones in that we still need to give it a name. And it's part of, there's so many species, like probably over 90% that still need to be discovered and named.
Well, what makes it scary?
It makes it scary because if we don't know that it's there, we don't know what they do. They might have some really special features about them that would help us live on land better. And if you didn't know my name and I didn't know your name, then that is also scary and sad. So species are that fundamental unit of biology where we're able to compare. Once we know who we're talking about, then we can be able to talk about the same animal and track changes. So, Woods Hole Oceanographic just filled its did such a great job talking about it, but we're a really special place of people that are trying to understand the environment and the animals and the ecosystem there. So I definitely encourage you to go to our website. Please take some information and start to also become your own explorer at Hui. So our ocean, I love this quote, isn't inherently supernatural or even scary, but it has a lot of unknowns, and sometimes those unknowns are the scariest part of all. So this is a really cute little snailfish that's also likely a new species that I'm working with collaborators at in Argentina. And so I hope you take away from this that the ocean isn't so scary, but it's full of, our deep ocean is full of wonder and a lot of unknowns that I hope that we get to continue, and some of you get to continue to study for the next very, very, very many years. So with that, happy to take any thank you and questions. And before, we'll also be gifting, I did see that I was at the library, but we're going to be gifting another book, Where the Weird Things Live, which is about some of the twilight zone animals, so the animals that are living in the water column that are beautiful and bright and not, that are like the anglerfish that are also not scary, but maybe a little bit weird. And so if you haven't seen it at the library, there's now 2 copies to check out. So thank you so much for hosting this and putting it on. I'm happy to take